Hi, and welcome back to Made Possible by Pop Culture, the podcast where I explore pop culture influences of the past and present with weekly guests. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Hugh Ryan to the pod. Hugh is a historian and an author of When Brooklyn Was Queer, The Women's House of Detention, A Queer History of a Forgotten Prison, and My Bad, A Personal History of Queer 90s and Beyond. The latter is his latest, and it's a personal account of nostalgia and finding one's identity on a backdrop that wasn't always welcoming, to put it mildly. He actually put growing up queer in the 80s and 90s as living through a war that nobody noticed. But wait, there's more. He's also the curator of the Pop-Up Museum of Queer History and co-host of Queer History 101. So obviously there is a lot to discuss today, including his past pop culture pick, 1995's cult classic, To Wong Foo, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar. So Hugh, welcome to Made Possible by Pop Culture. I'm very excited. First of all, that movie is something that I hadn't thought about in a long time. And when I read the book before, obviously, for anyone who's listening to this, I always read the books before I invite people on because I want to make sure I like it first. And I read his book, and there's a little mention of the movie in the book, and that made me so excited that I went and I rewatched the movie. And
Oh,
then he picked it. So I'm very excited about this overall.
I love that film, and any excuse to talk about it, write about it, watch it again, I will take. Thank you so much, Danielle, for having me on. I love as a historian, I'm always thinking about like how does the culture of yesterday affect the culture of today? And with my new project, how does it affect me? So I think this is just such a brilliant idea, and I'm delighted to get into it all.
Well, I'm glad that you are equating the things that I talk about here with culture and history because there for so long pop culture was pop culture because people didn't think it was serious enough to like be considered part of, regular culture, and people didn't
Mhm.
study it the way that they do now. And I don't want to say that your books are not much more serious than my podcast. They are. Obviously, just based on the titles that I listed, there's a lot of forgotten things that should not have been forgotten that you've brought to the forefront. But you brought up a really great point a second ago in the sense of like, it's also your history. Your newest book is a lot more vulnerable and personal for yourself than your first two books. Can you just walk me through a little bit of like what it took to be so open in terms of,
Mhm.
was it your idea or was this something that maybe you were always working on but you didn't want to release first? How did that come about in like I guess also the order of your works?
It's a little bit of both. I will say this. I think my biggest influence in publishing this book was my bank balance in 2022.
Okay.
I
But
gotta be honest.
you could have
I love
picked,
history.
right. I was gonna say you could have picked a topic that was not as vulnerable.
Yes. And I thought about that. But the truth is that I do have training as a personal essayist. This is what I thought I wanted to do,
Mhm.
25 years ago when I was first thinking about writing as a career, before I started doing it and realized that I found it, like you said, so vulnerable. And I'm just not someone who particularly enjoys that. And so for a long time, I wrote lots of other things, which I love. I love history more than anything else. But it does not sell as well as memoir. And
Hmm.
I am very cognizant about having a career in writing. I want to have this career. I want to be long lasting. I want to write for a living. It's how I process the world. And so if there's something that I can do that I know will sell better than what I'm already doing, there's an attraction there that I cannot deny. I think that that is the reality of being an artist in the world today. You have to figure out like what do I have and
Hmm.
how can I pitch that to the world. So I love my book. I love writing about culture. I love writing about the 90s, which I am maybe a little too obsessed with. But I can't lie. It really did come about because I was like, I want to be a professional writer. I want
Hmm.
to earn my living this way. And queer history books just don't sell that well.
I mean, that's very unfortunate to hear. So I grew up in Brooklyn, and so when Brooklyn was queer was something that I had never heard of until I read your book. In the sense of, we know there are gay people everywhere. We know there are queer
Yeah, yeah.
people everywhere. Like just if we're awake in the world, but we don't know their stories. And I grew up at a time when it seemed very stereotypical New York, like you had your ethnicities kind of still segregated in different pockets
Hmm.
of the city. And a lot of those ethnicities were very old-fashioned and old school about we don't talk about the gay cousin or
Yeah.
we don't acknowledge and this is something that you talk about in your book too, and just your own coming out journey and the way that we talk about it. But so reading your book felt like, oh, this is something that they should have been talking to us about in school. Like if we're not talking
Yeah.
about it at home, it should be talked about in school. And so I understand what you're saying in terms of like commercially, maybe that's hard, but it does feel like you should be able to sell it to the schools. Like, you should be able to
I
get a
know.
pocket of money by,
You know.
yeah, listen, I get it. We're in a political landscape where like that's a nightmare, but it's kind of it's one of those things that like to hear you say that out loud and put it in those simple terms is upsetting.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I will say it is obviously the political climate. It's also a reality of just like, getting people, adults who are buying books for pleasure, who have busy lives and so much going on. It's hard, even if you're interested in the topic, to be like, I'm going to pick up a dense work of history that's got a lot of footnotes.
Mm,
And I say that as someone who loves a footnote.
yeah,
So I do not in any way, I am not unhappy with people who are not interested in reading that kind of book. I just know it's a specific audience. I think of it as very much like a dad audience. When I was a kid, my dad read like all books about World War II, like
hmm,
endlessly. If there was a book about World War II, he would read it. And so I love that kind of book. But I wanted to do something else. And yes, it's financial, but it gives me a different way to express myself. I like to be funny. I often joke that I would be very decorative if I lived in a time where I didn't need to be political. Do you know? Like,
sure,
I want to be fun. And I think that comes across in this book in a way where you can't quite have fun when you're
yeah.
writing third person nonfiction. Nobody wants too many jokes in a history or it starts to feel really suspect. And this allowed me room to like just run and be myself and talk how I wanted to and have opinions without fact checking them. And I really let myself go on this one. Like there are places where I did fact check, moments where I looked
Sure.
in and talked to people. But for the most part, I was like, no, this is about how I see and interpret the world. And even where I got it wrong, I still want to communicate that.
Right. And that I think there is also a difference of like, I am putting this story out that is my place in the culture of the time. And so even if you get it wrong, like if you were getting it wrong at that time, it's still true because it was true to your experience. It might not be true for somebody else's experience, but you're not telling their story in this case. And so
Exactly.
I also kind of feel like I do want to say for anybody who got scared by the footnote comment, there aren't footnotes in this new one, so
No.
you'll be okay. But for that reason, I imagine too, is just the like, well, this is my version of my story, my history, and so I don't need to footnote myself.
Exactly. It's like this is footnote and fancy free. That's what I like to tell people.
Nice. That should be the marketing tagline. No, I'm kidding. So I always try to talk about the past first. Obviously, your book dives into the past, but when I say the past on this podcast, I mean past pop culture. So as I mentioned, you do bring up To Wong Foo in your book. I do want to talk a little bit more in detail about your love of it, where it stemmed from, like where it started really in terms of that first viewing, if you can bring us back to remembering where you were in your life, if you were in a theater, if you were at home, etc., and what sat you down in front of a movie like that
Mm.
to begin with. Because I will speak for myself and I will say that that trailer it felt more about the stars of the movie in a way, if I'm remembering it properly,
Yeah.
than it was about the movie. It kind of sold the movie as like Wesley Snipes and Patrick Swayze as you've never seen them, plus a road trip. And I was like, yes, it is a road trip movie, but there's so much more here that you're leaving out. And it felt like maybe you're leaving it out at the time because you were worried people wouldn't come if they kind of
Hmm.
knew the style and the nuances and maybe even some of the things that weren't nuanced enough. But you take us back and tell me your origin story.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you bring up something really important. For those of you who don't know the film, at the time, the fact that it was like Wesley Snipes, Patrick Swayze, John Leguizamo in these like main roles as well, they're going to call them drag queens in the film, and we'll get into that in
Right,
a second.
yes.
But but the fact that they were taking on these roles meant something immense. I mean, that was unexpected, unheard of. And then you had Robin Williams also in the film, and then you had all of these actual drag queens, RuPaul and Coco Peru and Candace Kane, who goes on to be this really important trans actor and
Hmm.
pioneer. And all of that coming in this film felt so important. And I totally missed it when it came out. I don't know if I was like asleep that month or like what
But you were
happened.
young too.
It
So
was
that's
1995, so I'd been
right.
17.
But that's
But I
also part
just,
of the discussion I always like to have with people because it does feel like sometimes these things that become important to us in our childhoods don't always hit us when they're important in the culture, the wider culture moment, because we're at different places in our lives. And I will say for myself, like I say this all the time on the podcast, like I wasn't allowed to see a lot of things.
yeah.
Oddly, I was allowed to see this. My mother took me to see this in theaters and I was 10. And that's what
Oh my
baffles me.
God.
She's not around anymore to ask, but like that's what baffles me is that she had such strong feelings on like things I shouldn't see for like sexual content or cursing or whatever, but she was like, this is fine. And I'm glad she thought it was fine, but it's fascinating, especially on the backdrop of today, where there's all of this conservatism against, again, drag queens. And like you said, there's a little bit more here to this movie where like maybe some of these characters were trans and they just didn't talk about it that way. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, back then, I remember there was one movie theater. It was about a 25-minute drive away. I did not have a car. I did not have a license. It was very easy for me to just not get to the movies in the suburbs, miss them entirely. But about a year later, I went off to college, and I think it was my older friend Amy Lauren who sat me down and showed me this film. It was definitely like an older gay person who older, they were
Well,
19 and I was 17. It felt older at the time, they had access to the world and I was just coming out of the suburbs. But definitely sat me down and was like, this film is amazing. Also, and this was really the crucial part, it had real gay people in it. It had real queer people in it. It came from the point of view. I mean, it's a fantasy, right? It's like a little bit of reverse Cinderella. It's a little bit of road trip movie. It's a little bit of like, a stranger comes to town and magically fixes everything. But it was the first time I ever heard a gay person say to another gay person, like, oh, you're being queer, like queer used as an affectionate term as opposed to an insult.
right.
And what I loved and what sort of remained with me, and the reason I bring it up in the book, and one of the things that I think is so important to me about this film, is there's a very early moment in which Wesley Snipes explains to John Leguizamo's character what a drag queen is.
Hmm.
And from today's point of view, it's a little nonsensical and it doesn't exactly fit with what's happening in the film, but it was very much the world of the 90s, the world that I came up in, where I did not learn much about what it meant to be queer or trans or gay other than AIDS, right? I learned about AIDS. I learned a little bit about the Bible because I was Catholic and went to
Right.
CCD every Wednesday. So, I got that education. But John Leguizamo's character is like the young up and coming queen who they call a drag princess. And Wesley Snipes and Noxeema Jackson and Patrick Swayze, Miss Vita Boheme, are the like reigning queens of the pageant world in the film. And Wesley Snipes explains that when a straight man puts on a dress and gets his sexual kicks, then he's a transvestite. When this is the one that really made me laugh. When a man is a woman trapped in a man's body and he gets the operation singular,
Right. Right.
then he's a transsexual. And when a gay man has too much fashion sense for one gender, he's a drag queen. And I was always at that time in my life looking for some kind of like instructions on like what did it mean to be gay? I had a sense of myself as different. I knew that I was attracted to men and to women from an early age, but more to
Hmm.
men. But I didn't. I also knew I didn't fit in, and that I did not was not like the other boys, and so I was always looking for anything that would tell me about what gay life was. And I had before this looked to sources like I can remember that Dire Straits song, Money for Nothing.
Oh, I don't
Do you
know
remember
that.
this?
No, I'm not great
It's
with
like
music.
it's a fantastic song, and it's from the point of view, at least in the video, of these like appliance repair guys who
Okay.
are moving appliances to make money, and they're watching MTV, and they're like talking about how that little faggot he's got with long hair, that little faggot, he's a millionaire,
Oh,
you
jeez.
know? And I was like, okay, so faggots have long hair, but also they can be millionaires. Like, this is
Oh,
interesting.
I
I'm
see.
learning
Okay.
something here? And so this was very much that, but from a gay point of view, right? Even though I knew that there was like almost no question that the leads in the play or in the show were all straight men.
Right.
still you could sense that there was something here that was coming from a queer perspective that was more knowledgeable in a time where like nobody was going to sit down and explain what was the difference between a transvestite, a transsexual, and a drag queen to me anywhere else, not in school, not at home, not in the newspapers. And so this really felt like an older gay person kind of like took my hand and was like,
Mm,
here is something you need to know. These are things you need to know. And that was what I was looking for when I went away to college, right? Like I
yeah.
was like, yeah, classes, whatever. I need to find like that world and figure out my place in it.
Yeah.
And so forever after, this movie really kind of like sat in that bevy of knowledge that I gained, which like everything else I learned in the 90s was like piecemeal and slightly incorrect and still being figured out. But you know, I didn't have the internet. I mean, I guess by the time I saw
Well,
this film, I did.
but even still, this was the way it was being talked about more widely than this movie, right? So like I think, it's piecemeal, but it's also like the language they're using was the language of the time. So at a certain point, I know you got to the point where you were like, oh, that's not fully it, and that's not, the right word to use, but so did everybody else. Like it wasn't,
Yeah.
the one thing I will say is that like I used to watch a lot of TV and movies to learn things as well. And you had that whole, I don't know, it's not really a fear, but you in the back of your head, it was like, is this accurate? Because it's a fictional movie. I'm aware that it's a fictional movie. Are they making this up, or is this close enough to the reality of the lesson I'm trying to distill from this, right? And that's a lot to ask of any narrative film. But it did feel like at the time, like this was really, we had a lot of road trip films. We didn't have, I would argue, anything like most of the road trip films in the 90s were like very male in the traditional like heterosexual cisgender like
Hmm.
quote unquote American like Hollywood archetype male road trip film, or the like sort of romantic road trip film with the exception of Thelma and Louise.
Thelma
but
and Louise, yeah.
but that's so it was like you saw these characters in this very common at the time anyway, tropey style of movie, but you had characters you had never really seen before. And so like that alone too was like, oh, you're kind of learning about this other way of life again, whether it's fully true or not, you
Yeah,
learn
and I think it
later.
was it was of a time where we really didn't know what words meant what. I mean,
True.
you know, I say this all the time. Right around the same period, Leslie Feinberg is an incredible scholar who writes like the first like trans history from a trans point of view. It's called Transgender Warriors, and the subtitle is From Joan of Arc to RuPaul. And
Hmm.
then today, no one's going to think about RuPaul as transgender, but the word meant something different then, right?
Right.
And that's so much of what I'm trying to get across in my memoir, My Bad, is this time in the 90s where things one meant different things, but also you weren't sure what things meant. There was a lot of uncertainty, both personally in my life about like what was my identity, what was my gender versus my
Right.
sexuality, but also just in the world, you know, like all the time I would spend so much time arguing about things that you could not look up, right? Like from lyrics to songs that you loved to the ending of a movie. When I saw the Blair Witch Project in 1999, I was not sure if it was real footage or if it
Oh.
was a fictional horror
Well, I mean,
film.
that's what they wanted. I don't know why I said it that way. That is what they wanted. That is the experience most people were supposed to have. I will say I didn't have that experience. I was like, this is fake. But that's because I was a very like cynical. I didn't know anything about the marketing, but I was like, I'm just cynical and I don't believe in this type of supernatural stuff. So like, there's no way this is real. What? Even if I thought they were real people, I didn't think what they were experiencing was anything other than their own paranoia. So.
Yeah.
But that's exactly it. Like it was a time where like there were things that I remember fully getting wrong because you couldn't look things up and the person who gave me the answer was wrong. And so then I
Yes.
went about my life like just for years so sure, and somebody finally would stand up and correct me, and I'd be like, "Oh, it never occurred to me once we got like Google to double check because I had
No.
been so sure, like pronunciation of words, like
Hmm.
stupid things, honestly."
So many things. I thought it was Lyme's possessive disease. Like there was a guy
Hmm.
named Lyme who possessed the disease. I don't know where I got that from. It
Doesn't
just was in
matter.
my head.
Yeah, yeah. You just heard it a certain way, and then like it stuck.
Hmm.
I want to go back to what you were talking. I didn't mean to derail us. I want to go back to what you were talking about in terms of like the identities in this film, because you do mention this in the book in the sense of like the characters kind of have incoherent identities, and again, I do think it goes back to like the language at the time, and maybe even the writer and director not really wanting to get into the weeds of like is a character questioning whether they're a man or a woman or not.
Hmm.
But it did, I do feel like the way they explained the gender spectrum made sense at the time. It was the way that it was understood at the time. When you look back at the movie now, do you feel like there are things that tip it one way or the other that you could say, like, oh, I feel like this character really would have been, should have been trans, the way that like we look at Rent and people now talk about Angel as like that's a trans character.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that Patrick Swayze's Miss Vida Boheme, well, we never see the leads out of drag except in the
Right.
very, very beginning
Little
where
bit
they're
with
getting
Leslie.
dressed. Yeah, and it's to Body Beautiful by Salt and Pepper, which is a fabulous song. And though I did not recognize it at the time, full of references to the world of ballroom and voguing, which meant
Mm.
nothing to me then. But
Hmm.
now, another one of those moments where I'm like, this film knew things that I did not know, and I couldn't even pick up on all of them. But we never see them out of drag. And Miss Vita Boheme in particular has a couple of moments throughout the course of it. There's a scene of family rejection, of her parents not being willing to even look at her, and that she's given up this whole life. None of them really have families that they talk about, which feels very of the 90s, queer, trans, there's
Hmm.
this level of rejection. And then at the very end of the film, Stockard Channing's character says to Patrick Swayze, "I love you, Miss Vida Boheme,"
Right.
and Patrick Swayze says, "I've been waiting my whole life to hear those words said to that name." Right? And that's not a drag queen experience. That's a trans woman waiting to be recognized, And there are so many moments in this film that really like talk about issues that we are still having today. I mean, the big sort of crux moment is that they're driving in full beat, in full drag,
Hmm.
and Patrick Swayze's ID doesn't match. It says Eugene on it, and they
Right.
get pulled over. And I mean, there are 6 states right now that have invalidated trans people's licenses, right? Like these are issues that are so alive today, and this film captured them and the danger of the cops.
Yep.
For the most part, I think the film has a really light tone, a really fun and accessible tone. But there's this moment where the sort of central antagonist, the cop who pulls them over, is getting laughed at by other cops because a girl
Yep.
beat him up. And he says, "I'm going to drag 3 corpses back here. And
Hmm.
when you stick your hand up their skirts, you're gonna," and then it sort of like trails off into the police just laughing. Right. And
Yeah.
like that is an intense, dark moment. And for that to kind of show up in a comedy in the way that it is, tells us something about where we were then versus now. There are jokes in this film that could no. RuPaul shows up wearing a Confederate flag with the
Yeah.
name Rachel Tension. She's not doing that today, let me tell
Right.
you. And I love the movie for that. It feels very real to its period. It feels complicated. It feels not cut and dried. It feels like their identities, yeah, are a little unclear, but also, I'm sure that's how many people like myself experienced identity in that moment. There wasn't easy, accessible language. Decisions hadn't been made about where those lines were. All 3 of the leads seem to have had, no hormones, no sort of surgical procedures, which were
Right.
much rarer than back then, much harder to access. So, what is the difference between a drag queen and a trans woman in a world without surgical procedures? And I think that these characters, to me, sit pretty firmly on the side of trans, non-binary people
Hmm.
whose identities, not just their professions, are based in sort of crossing the gender lines. Otherwise, like, why drive across America in drag? That's a lot of dressing up to do, you
Yes.
know?
Yes. That's that. So that was something that I always thought about too, just in the sense of like they are not just doing this for the pageant that that they're going across the country to enter. If you're just going across the country to enter a pageant, you put all that stuff in your trunk. You go, you get it on for the
Hmm.
pageant, and you leave. If you're wearing it every day, it says a lot more about like where or how you feel comfortable,
Yeah.
or most like yourself. And so that to me was always something that I thought was really interesting about the film. But a lot of those pieces that you just talked about in terms of like the way they present, I also always thought, well, you have male and male identifying actors playing these roles. Like if it was done today and you hired actual trans performers in
Hmm.
maybe even in different stages of transition, like there wouldn't be the line that's in the movie like, "Oh, I know you're a man because I saw your Adam's apple." Like and
Yeah.
that character accepted them and it was not meant maliciously, but it was an interesting point of like, "Oh, maybe part of what I'm watching, and I didn't clock this when I was 10, but I clocked this, a little bit older, was just like maybe part of what I'm watching with how they pass or how they don't pass is limited by who they have in the roles, not in anything that has to do with their characters, which is this other level to filmmaking and
Hmm.
filmmaking at the time that I was like, I almost wish this is a movie that we could see a version of. And obviously, trans performers have films, I mean,
Yeah.
RuPaul has done TV shows and films, and Bianca Del Rio has, it's like there's a lot of options. Well, Bianca's not trans, RuPaul's not trans. I said
Yeah.
drag
But
queens.
Candace Kane, who's in
But
the
yes,
film,
yes.
yeah.
I mean, Alexandra Billings, like there's a lot of people who thankfully now are getting work, even if they're not getting the starring roles. Like Pose is a
Yeah.
great example of like how we've been able to see that come forward.
Yeah.
But
Michaela J. Rodriguez.
yeah, my point initially was going to be like really more about the film, a version of that story done today. Like if there is a thing that you feel like you want to see on screen today to be able to say, this was great for what it was at the time, and I'm not knocking it, but there's still so much to talk about in today's language, and we shouldn't be looking to a 30-year-old movie with the wrong language. We should have something of today.
Yeah, although I will say this, what I love about the film is, especially towards the end, we get all of these moments of real, uh, I mean, it's a really feminist film. It's a film that says trans women and cis women are affected by the same violence, the same rapey men, the same
Mhm.
patriarchy, the same violent police, the same violent husbands, that there is a synergy in these communities that I think oftentimes today films that talk about trans women focus more on their connections with gay men, obviously for lots of reasons, or trans men. But this sort of like the meeting between cis and trans women, I think, is really important in this film, and that the trans people show up in town, and it leads to this like beautiful gendarchy where like the patriarchs are overthrown, the violent men are thrown out, the police are ridiculed and driven out of town, the young boys who are on a bad path learn to do better. And Stockard Channing's character, after saying, like, yes, I noticed your Adam's apple,
Right.
later says, you're my lady friend with an Adam's apple. This idea that it's not about the body,
Right.
in that same way. And I think all of that is like what is best about this movie?
Yes, but you said it earlier, it is a fantasy.
It's a fantasy.
And I'm not saying it's
Absolute
bad.
fantasy.
I'm not saying it's bad to have a fantasy. I do think there's way too much trauma porn when we look at queer characters and trans characters on TV and film. That's something I used to write about a lot. But because it is a fantasy, I keep going back to there's a moment in the film where there's a few moments in the film actually where like Patrick Swayze gets to kick some ass. And
Yeah.
obviously that's, he's not Patrick Swayze in that moment, but a version of you is like, of course he is, because he was this like male heartthrob at the
Hmm.
moment. And even though they dressed him in drag and this character is probably trans, like it's still speaking to that patriarchal idea of like, I'm gonna kick someone's ass
Yeah.
instead of, winning them over another way or changing
Hmm.
hearts and minds, which, again, that's also fantastical in its own way. Um, and those were the moments that I feel like when I watched it almost took me out of it a little bit because I
Yeah.
was like, that felt, you could feel the female touches on the film, you could feel the Hollywood touches on the film, and that to me felt a little bit Hollywood of like we have to give this moment that I don't know. I don't know that I don't think we would do that today. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying we need the reality of like Patrick gets his ass kicked. That's awful, but something in the middle.
Yeah, yeah, a different way of solving this problem than sort of like just swapping out the traditional man beating up another man for
Correct.
drag queen beating up a man. Yeah.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
I think there are some moments where we get like some stuff that like the moment where they start the makeover of the town and the Wonder Woman theme is playing and they throw a scarf in the air and it lands
Yeah.
perfectly to cover a lamp. That feels very like a almost like an older style of
Mhm.
movie, honestly. A little I Dream of Jeannie, a little like uh all of that, the whole like fashion review section of it, and it's fun, it's campy, but it does feel very much of its moment to me. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't think if this were done today, it would be grittier. They would find the clothes to transform the Strawberry Social, but they would feel a little bit more realistic. And in the end, I think Stockard Channing's character and Patrick Swayze's character would end up together in like a lesbian relationship. There is such a like
Interesting.
vibe between the two of them. That's what I think. That's where I think they would go really different to kind of give those characters because the end of the film, I feel, is very 90s in the sense that they
Oh,
transform that world, but it's not their world, and they leave, and they do not have new lovers or new family.
yeah.
The three of them are bonded together as like queer people in this little bubble, and they go to another world where they perform at the end with these other
Mhm.
queens in LA, but like they don't get to have relationships. They don't get to have family. They don't, and that feels very 90s to me, you
Yeah.
know? And I
Yeah.
think that's a very mainstream representation. And this film really interestingly branches, or not branches, connects like those late 90s independent gay films like Love, Valor, Compassion and Broken Hearts Club and
Mhm.
all those great films that I love that are trying to be gay, but a little happy and real, and they have real relationships with more like mainstream straight films,
Yeah.
or even plays like you mentioned Rent, where it's like straight characters at the center and the gay people are sort of like side notes. And this film is in between, as it is in
Mhm.
everything, and that is what I love about it. This indeterminacy, this way in which it is very real but also not real at all, and the way in which even their identities are like that. It just all feels so quintessentially 90s to me, and I love the 90s. And so
Yeah.
this film just really affected me as a young person. It affected me in terms of like how I thought about what it meant to be queer. It affected me in terms of how I thought my life might go or would be. I also like wore way too much of that 90s revisits the 60s, hippie, bell bottoms, headbands, leather vests with fringe. Like, I don't know what I was thinking, but it was definitely straight from that film.
Okay. Well, that's what you were thinking. You were inspired. If you, so you talking about like the changes maybe with Carol Ann Stockard's character, and Vita Patrick's character. Would Chi-Chi still win the Drag Queen of America pageant in this new version?
I think she would. I think that that was something that like it really fits the film that they take her on and then they promote her and she becomes, but I almost feel like maybe not all three of them would go there. Like that would be
Okay.
the ridiculous part now, the part that's totally unreal and we'd look back and be like that's not real at all. It's like Miss Vida Bohem would be like I'm going to stay here
Sure.
with Carol Ann and we're going to run this hotel and the other two would go on to LA. That's how I feel like a modern version would be unreal.
Okay. I like that a lot. And I always loved the idea that like Chi-Chi, who in the beginning was like the newcomer, the one who like didn't have the look fully together, didn't have everything, like that was also the journey of we're not just teaching this town and walking away from this town, we're also bringing her up with us and in that very like drag mother way of
Yeah.
passing the torch, keeping the door open, whatever, metaphors we want to use, which
Hmm.
is something I only learned about really through drag culture because I came from a very competitive environment of like your friends are also your competitors for the best grades. Like, don't hold the door open for them. Like, keep
Yeah.
it closed and make sure you're at the top, which I didn't vibe with because I didn't care. But
Yeah.
so it was so interesting to then internalize that piece of this movie as a young kid of like, oh, yeah, why are we not helping each other? That's bullshit.
Uh, it's so kind. The movie is so kind over and over again, so open-hearted. And I've watched a lot of stuff with John Leguizamo afterwards because I think
Oh,
he,
so
of
good.
all of them, did the best job at sort of embodying that character. And he talks a lot about how they paired each of them with drag queens. He was with
Hmm.
Larissa Dumont, who took him to like Escuelita, a club that I used to go to up on like Times Square, 44, 42nd, anyway, up there, and like learned all this stuff. And he said, one of the really subtle journeys that happens in that film is that Chi-Chi at the beginning is using a foundation that is way too light on her face, and it
Mhm.
does not match her neck. And he said, one, I wanted to show that she was not quite as talented a queen yet. She hasn't learned her makeup. But two, he said, I had a lot of people in my family who were ashamed of their dark skin and
Mm.
used lighter makeup. And so part of her journey, even though it's like a very subtle one and it's not one that we're talking about a lot, is coming to terms with her own racial identity in a world, particularly among, drag queens, where it was still a white sort of aesthetic is the thing that's going to win. And so as you watch over the course of the film, she learns to do her makeup better and she takes on a darker foundation that
Mhm.
matches her skin tone. And like those little journeys also are like what just make this film
Yes.
so good.
Honestly, I mean, this is one of the more inclusive films of that time anyway. I mean, if you just look at the three of them, they're not all white characters, and that is huge, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And it's so and fun in that way and so also reflective, not that the gay world was anything like perfect. It was full of racism. Like let's not just pretend it wasn't. But at that time, I remember going to lots of gay bars, lots of clubs, and there was this sort of like, especially if you were in a smaller town, there was one bar, so
Mhm.
everybody went.
Right,
And sometimes that might meant that like, women were less welcome, people of color experienced racism, but it also could mean that those spaces were more mixed because they had to be.
right,
And so that also felt very real in a way that felt appropriate.
right. We've been talking a lot, or I mostly have keep talking about the things I'm learning from this movie. It does feel like because a movie like this, and I will even go as far to say as books like yours are still in the minority in the sense of, as you were talking about, like you said, they were harder sells. So that means obviously there are probably a lot more of these stories that are just out there that we are still not aware of. What does the responsibility feel like for you? Do you feel a responsibility to educate, even with your own story? Like writing a story like My Bad is your story, as we already talked about, but you are also talking about the culture at the time and the clubs at the time and the feelings around AIDS at the time and a lot of different things. There's some sections in there about like crisis hotlines and working with groups for younger teens and children and was it a responsibility that you felt to kind of educate people, or is it just natural that like, well, these were my stories, so if they educate somebody, great.
A little bit of both, but I will say that when I started doing this, one of the things that was really top of my mind is that I had been seeing a lot of things that were starting to like reconsider the 90s. Um, that 90s show, Everything
Yeah.
Sucks. There was a bunch of other things. And while I enjoyed them all, and I loved it, and the flannels would be right, and the boys would all have that nice middle parted hair that was like really straight. It was like very Leonardo DiCaprio on
Good
Growing
gosh.
Pains, like stuff that
It's
I
so
loved,
painful when you say that because I still part my hair in the middle and I'm not a guy, but it still hurts me a little because I'm like, oh, that's right. That's right. Yep.
So of the 90s. And they would get all of that right, and then almost like invariably, there would be a gay character. They would come out immediately.
Mm,
There would be like 15 seconds of like, I don't know. Oh no. And then everyone would be like, this is totally cool. They
right.
would absolutely know themselves. They would be like, I'm gay. This is what I like. This is what I'm into. They would have a relationship by the end of the episode. Nobody's parents would get mad. Or maybe there'd be like one bully, but he would be clearly a bad person,
Right.
you know? And I just was like, what is this shit?
Well,
What
it's
is
because
this
they're making it
bullshit?
for now. They're
Yeah.
trying to say like, hey, like we know this is how it should be. Again, it goes back to it's like the fantasy version.
Yeah, but I would see all of these younger people really longing for the 90s. And I found myself wanting to sort of pull that apart because I was like, if you're longing for that vision where, like, yes, there weren't very many gay people, but everybody was nice to you and you knew yourself, that did not exist. But what I often heard when I talked to people about that longing for the 90s, to my younger cousins or just, younger people that I would meet, it was really about a pre-internet life. Even if they didn't state it
Oh,
that
I
way, the
see.
longing was for a world in which like you had a group of people and you weren't constantly being pulled away by the phone, everyone wasn't
Yeah.
distracted, you didn't feel this constant pressure and surveillance, and everything you did wasn't on social media as an Instagram photo, and so you could go and be free. And so I was like, okay, there are two things going on here that I feel really like I feel a responsibility for pulling apart. One is the gay stuff was nothing like what you think it is. Like it's just the media representations of it are wrong, and we need to set that right. I understand why they're wrong in the same way that like my generation looked to the 60s and was like, "Oh my God, it was perfect." So I wanted to fix that. But I also really wanted to get into what life was like for those of us, and I think you're a little younger than me, but we're close enough.
Yeah.
I really felt like I grew up in an analog world. Even though
Hmm.
I had email, by the time
Hmm.
I got to high school, my family did have the internet. It was like a very minor part of my life. And I really clung to it because it seemed like a possible place to learn about queer people, to find myself when I was in the suburbs and did not have anyone. I'd never met a gay person an out gay person by the time I came out. I'd never met one. So that I really was drawn to. But over the years, watching the internet grow and expand and become what it is today, I could understand why young people wanted what we had. We had a fully analog childhood and a fully digital adulthood. And I don't think there will be another American generation that experiences childhood the way we did. There might be
Yeah.
individuals, but no one will have that world in which there is no real cell phones, there is no social media. You aren't the only photographs I have before I'm like 25 are like doubles somebody got when they went to the mall,
Right.
like that's it. And that was amazing.
It, hearing you talk about it, you just use the word amazing. So, I mean, there are things I remember fondly, but I also do hear the other part of what you just said of like you had never met an out gay person until before you came out. And so like to me, that is kind of the beauty of the internet sometimes is that like yeah, there's a lot of trolls, there's a lot of negativity, but you can also connect with people that you think might be like you. And there
Yeah.
is like you talk a lot, I'm going to put it very simply, but like you talk a lot in the book about like the loneliness versus community. And that to me was also very interesting in the sense of if you feel different, wanting to be able to find people who are like you and be embraced by them, sure, but also I think sometimes just to know that like there is no other, you're not other, there are people like
Yeah.
you, and that
Yeah.
to me felt like impossible in the early 90s, like again, before AOL, before internet, sorry, before email, and I didn't care. Like the things that I felt other about, I was like, great, I don't want anybody else to like this. I want to be over here on my little cloud by myself. And as I've gotten
Smoking a
older,
clove cigarette, listening to Tori Amos. That's what I wanted.
well, I mean, I said this to Stephen Canals. I was like, something that floored me about Pose was like these characters didn't feel supported in their family. They were kicked out, or they knew they had to leave for some reason, even though some of them did actually have, we learned later, some support, but they wanted to find another family. They wanted to find a community. And that to me was so foreign an idea. I was like, I want to leave my family behind, but I want to be over here on my island by myself. So to hear
Yeah.
you talk about it as like the idealization of that analog world, like I get that. But then I also kind of feel like it has to be so hard though when you are the person who wants the community and is seeking out the thing that I am that I want to find in another person.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that like that was something that you like struggled with per se, but I do want to talk a little bit about how I guess you worked through that in
Yeah.
the earlier, especially in the earlier years, but also how you worked through it writing the book about the
Mhm.
experience. Do you know what I
Those
mean?
are two. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's like you probably worked through it a certain way, but then to go back and revisit it, you have to put yourself back in those shoes. And maybe it's therapeutic, but maybe it's re-traumatizing.
Yeah, I'll say this. Like at the time, I mean, there's a reason it was called the World Wide Web. You're absolutely right. It was about connection. It was about all of these different threads coming together in ways that we could not have before. And that in its own way was amazing. And I definitely wanted that, was hungry for it. And that I think is what's good about the internet in many ways, that it does open us up to new things. It enables people who could not go to places to get information, especially younger people, to get information at an earlier age, like I
Yeah.
think that is so essential, so important. And don't want to downplay that because I think that
Yeah.
it's very easy for me to slip into a like, oh, it's worse now, but it's not. It is absolutely not worse now. It is, there is nowhere, no question that it is better. But the other side of that was this. Right around the time the internet really comes in, like 2000s, 2003, is the same time gay bars start to die off
Mm.
and the separate sort of queer communities, because the more you become part of the world, the more you both assimilate and are welcomed and all of this, the less energy you have to put into your separate world. And that's just the nature of it. Like my family's very Irish. We go back in New York City like over 100 years. And there was a period, my mom still has a little wooden phone booth from New York from the turn of the century that has an ad in it that says, no Irish colored
Mm.
people or dogs, right? Because the Irish were not part of,
Jesus.
yeah. And that it took coming out of the little Irish ghetto that my family grew up
Yeah.
in and becoming part of the world for that to change. Same thing has to happen with gay people. And the
Yeah.
internet is part of what facilitates it. But there was this time, and I got to benefit from the sort of tail end of it. In the late 90s, there were huge numbers of gay bars, huge numbers of gay bookstores. I could show up anywhere. I had very long hair. I wore a lot of like women's clothing. I was a lot more of a gender freak at that time, really trying to figure out my identity.
Hmm.
And I would get harassed on the street regularly. People would throw Snapple bottles at me, and it was always Snapple bottles because they exploded into glass shards, and it was really fun to throw them, I'm sure. But I also could show up at anywhere, any city, and a gay person would find me and would
Mm.
be like, you should go to this bar tonight. You should go to this party. You should come sit with me, right? There was a world that I was told did not exist. I was told being gay was the lonely life. And it was to some degree when I did not have access to the gay world, because the gay world was a place you had to go to. You had to know where it was and you had to get to it. But once you got to it,
Right.
it was this whole other world where different rules applied. My favorite club, well, no, I had two favorite clubs in the 90s. I Tunnel, which was
Hmm.
amazing, and they had a party
Hmm.
called Curfew, which is really where I went the most. It was for young queer kids. But there was also Limelight, and I loved Limelight because on their like gay party that I went to, there were two different doors. One for straight people and one for gay people. And the gay people got to access the entire club and the straight people didn't. And that was very much what
Oh,
it felt like. Like once
that's
you were in, you had
hmm
access.
hmm It's funny. I think they closed before I was like of the right age, but I remember hearing older kids talk about that place. But they were straight kids, so I guess they didn't get to experience everything that
And
was
they had
there.
lots of different nights. So it wasn't
Oh,
always a
sure.
gay, yeah. Uh,
But
but it
even
was
still,
fabulous.
it's interesting to hear that perspective of like usually usually the world is open for them. And now you're just going to get a little part of it, like get a little taste of what we go through. And that's very
Mhm.
smart. I like that.
And the
Um,
bartenders, not bartenders, the door people would do crazy things that would not they would not get away with them today. But I definitely saw them like be like, "You two don't look gay to me. Make out. You
oh,
guys make out." It was great, and that is so
you're
different
right.
now.
They
I
would
went
never
and
be able to do that today. But
no. And I went back and I talked to my alma mater. I went to Cornell right after
yeah,
my
yeah, yeah.
first book when Brooklyn Was Queer came out. And the kids, when I was there was like no LGBT studies major. I was a women's studies major. There was an LGB, not T, like concentration or
Too
something.
early.
There was one gay bar. It was like 20 minutes outside of town because when it was in town, it had been firebombed by
Ooh.
homophobes. So they moved far away. And there was no, there was a very small resource center. When I went back, they had a huge resource center. They had a dorm that had 2 floors for queer people in it. There
Mm.
was an LGBT studies minor. I don't know if there was a major. And it felt like they had all this stuff. And when I sat down to talk to them, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so great. Like, you guys have all these things we didn't have. And they said, I guess so, but like we don't feel like we have community. Like
Yeah.
there's no gay bar. We don't all get together to go do things together, and just because you're out doesn't mean you have anything in common with anybody else, and we're all on the apps. And I was like, "Oh, that's really different." And so that was in my head too. You asked this question about like what responsibility did I feel?
Hmm.
And I was like, I think it can be so easy to look back on your past and either be like, here's what was great or here's what was terrible. And neither one of those frames fit when I tried to think about my past. The more, especially that I tried to write it, when I thought about it just sort of loosely,
Hmm.
I would be like, oh, that was terrible. That was great. That was terrible. That was great. When I went to write it, I had to like really reckon with that and
Yeah.
ask myself, like, what is the shape of the narrative that I'm telling? Is this like a it gets better story, or is this a like trauma story? And I had such a hard time, and here's what happened because of it. And neither of those frames worked. I was like, neither is complicated enough. Neither gets into enough of the good or the bad. And also, like, both of those frames felt like they excused me, right? That it was very easy to say like, oh, things were better and then the times changed and the world was
Oh,
worse
I
and so my
see.
my it's not my responsibility the things that I did or it was so awful that I hurt people but that wasn't my responsibility either. And actually, yeah, when I
Mm,
looked back, I was like lots of that stuff was true, but I also was like flighty and I liked to party, and I moved easily through friend groups
sure.
in part because I was so defensive. I built a lot of walls as a young gay person, because you had to, but it also meant that I could then just disappear and leave people behind and hurt people. And I wanted the book to be a reckoning, not just on
Mm,
like a generational level, but on a personal level, because I felt like so much of my life and so much of what is important in the book is about coming to terms with what it means to like love someone and hurt them
yeah.
and then apologize or be apologized to and grapple with how do you get past that? How do we grow up? If the story of queer people in America over these 30 years is one that largely has to do with a lot of assimilation and growth and change and opening, well, that means there's a lot of us who got hurt by something who are now in a position to sort of say like either you didn't apologize or you did apologize and here's how I feel now. And I was like,
Mm,
that's what I want to grapple with, the growth and the change, not an easy like this sucked or that was great kind of
right.
story. It's that gray that interests me.
So all of that being said, I mean, you also do talk a lot about your family. Do you have a different process when you're including other people's stories in your own story? Telling like you talk a lot about your grandmother and what she went through and how terrible her father was to her. Obviously, when they're not here to speak for themselves, maybe there's a little bit more of a weight off your shoulders about telling the story, but like then you also do talk about like your parents, obviously, when you told them, when you came out to them, and there's a great epilogue about, I'm probably giving spoilers now, but there's a great epilogue about like something your mother says when somebody else in your family is going through, identity, it is going through explaining their identity and don't do what we did, kind of learn from us, learn from our mistakes. Is your process different, I guess, just in terms of like the way that you tell those stories? Do you feel the reckoning has to be as strong if you're not, because you can't really speak for them, but you are including them because they're so important to your own journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is it was the biggest reckoning with the book was to sort of sit with that and be like, how do I tell this story in a way that feels true and respectful and allows all of us to be bad when we were bad? Because if you aren't, there's no growth, right? You cannot grow if there's not a place to grow from.
Yeah.
And so if I didn't let bad things happen, let people I love do bad things to me and let me do bad things to people I love, there was nowhere for us to go, right? There was no change. And then what was the point of this, And so I knew that I was going to have to get into stuff that was going to make us uncomfortable. I love my family. They are like my closest allies. We are so close. We are actual friends. I enjoy hanging out with them. But to get there was hard.
Hmm.
And when I wrote the book, largely the way that I did it was that I told myself, I'm going to write the truth now. But then I'm going to edit it and lie and make it easier and more saccharine later so that I don't have to talk to my parents about this and bring up the bad times. And that was the only way I could do it. Step by step, I told myself, later I'll lie. Later I'll edit this and I'll lie. I'll come back in and
Sure.
I'll take out all the hard parts and make it easy. I'm just writing this now for myself so I see the arc of it. And when it was done, I gave it to my younger brother. My younger brother is also gay. He is 10 years younger than me. We have, in some ways we're very similar, but we also came up in very different worlds.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, I think that he grew up in a family that was responding to the experiences they had had with me. And they were a little more equipped for having a queer child, which if you are a working class Irish Catholic family in the 80s, no one prepared you for that, right? And that was something that I came to see through this book, how much the stereotypes that I had in my head that were
Yeah.
guiding my actions were actually the same stereotypes my parents had in their heads. We expressed it differently, but we held the same shit because we grew up in the same world.
Yeah. I
And so
mean,
I,
they
I
pass
gave it
that
to my
down. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so I gave it to my younger brother and I was like, okay, I really need you to read this for me because as much as I loved my parents and I did not want to get anything wrong, I also didn't want them to influence the telling of this story. That felt important to me, that there was some part of this story that was about the divide from them that I had to overcome. And I did not, on a level, want to give that to them to edit. But I did want someone to look at it and say, like, oh, this might hurt someone. You're not thinking here.
Mm.
You're not. My brother gets it. He reads it. He's like, okay, let's talk. So we set up a time, we meet up, we have dinner, and I'm like, okay, so tell me, and I'm ready for him to tell me like, oh, this you've got this wrong, or this is going to hurt mom, or I don't think you should say that. And he was like, okay, so I think the first chapter is wrong. I think the last chapter needs to be cut too. This chapter's in the second person, and it really does not need to be in the
Okay.
second person. And I was like, wait. We're
That's
here
not
to
what I
talk about
want.
like family, emotional. And he was like, oh, that shit's fine. You guys are fine. That's cool. So, but you do need to cut the first chapter out. And he was right. All his edits were correct. I made huge edits
That's
after he read the book.
okay. So the first chapter that I read is not your real first chapter.
The real first chapter, which was the very first thing I wrote in this book that when I started, I thought was essential, he was like, no. And he was
Yikes.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nice that you have such a relationship where you trusted him on that.
And
I
that's what the book is about, getting to that
right.
place, right? So much of the book is about getting to a place with my family and myself that we can be like this with one
Right.
another. And that meant starting off from a much worse place.
But this is so small to most people, but because I covered the show for so many years, I have to ask. You have a line in the book about you have different opinions with your brother on the show Supernatural. What are your opinions and what were his? What is the difference? So
He has
nitpicky, I'm
tried to
aware.
he has tried to get me into the show. We watched the whole first season together, and I don't know. I don't see it.
Okay.
It seems fine to me. Like
Okay.
totally nice. But I also like was obsessively into Buffy, a show that I know many people have complicated thoughts about. So I know what it's like to love a show that maybe has an early first season episode that involves a mummy girl that is maybe one of the worst hours ever on television and still to love it. But I
Oh.
just never got the supernatural thing.
No, that's totally fair. And it's so small and nitpicky and not the point of your book at all. But the minute you called that out, I was like, wait, I have to, because I wrote about that show for 15 seasons. So
And I
here we
gotta say,
are.
I listened to your episode with Sarah Gamble because I love
Mm.
her and I love you and I loved The Magicians, maybe one of my favorite television shows ever. So like if she by any chance happens to listen to this, I just want to work in that I love all of her other work. It just the show didn't land for me, and that's a me thing, a problem with me,
It's
not
also fine
supernatural.
because you only watched season one. She wasn't running the show in season one. So
Yeah.
you're fine. Don't worry about it. And you said a couple times in your answer about the family, is this going to make mom mad? And should I edit or cut this? I'm going to go back and, lie and make it nicer. Like that is not an attitude you have to have. I say this all the time. Like you are under, no author is under any obligation to be nice to the people in their books, especially if it's not true to their experience. So like you just are too nice. You're just worrying about things you don't need to worry about is my point.
I
Um,
think for me, the reason I worry so much about it, honestly, is that growing up in the 90s, it often felt like being gay was choosing a world that was not your family. That was
mhm,
part of the choice, that you got one or the other. And I had older relatives who had made the other choice,
right.
who either were completely closeted, never came out their entire lives, or were sort of like they lived with a friend. Everyone kind of knew, but it was also unspoken, but they were at all the parties, and
Mhm.
that felt like such a fundamental choice. And while it felt important to me to talk about it and to chart the growth, and that we did have this growth arc, so I had somewhere else to go, it did feel, or my worry, and it was not this way, was that I was opening that door up again, that door to the pain that all of us experienced, and that I was once again going to be the problem child,
Mm.
that like I couldn't stop being the problem. And that was a feeling I had all the time in the 90s, that I was a problem in every room I walked into, that people from the second I walked in were trying to figure out what to do with me. It's funny. This is another thing that I think about with To Wong Foo and with my
Yeah.
other historical work. If you look back in US history, queer people, particularly trans people, are all the time getting arrested under public disorder laws.
Hmm.
And the idea was that your presence in public was so destabilizing that it caused other people to do crazy things. And while I don't think that's a reason anyone should be arrested, that was certainly true. And you see it in To Wong Foo. All they have to
Hmm.
do is show up, and the whole like house of cards tumbles. Everything rearranges itself around their existence, good, bad, in between. And that is often how it felt in the 90s. If you were really visibly queer, if you were weird, if you were freaky, like you didn't know when you walked into a room if
Yeah.
someone was gonna like come out to you in like quietly in the corner and be like whisper their soul, or if they were gonna punch you.
Yeah.
But either of those things could have happened. And so to write this book felt a little bit like, oh, I'm doing it again, you know?
Hmm.
I'm making myself the problem.
Well, I wasn't going to say making yourself the problem, but you are opening up and telling things that I used the word vulnerable earlier, but even now, when I'm thinking about some of the stories you tell, like about taking AIDS tests in college or, almost being assaulted and things like that, like these are stories that it would be so hard to tell someone, I think, one on one sometimes. You're just saying, I'm telling everybody at once. But is that true? Did you feel like you had to tell anyone in your life before the book came out? Were you holding any of these stories back and said, okay, before you see it in print, I should tell you about this?
Ooh, yes. Well, yeah, there are a lot of stories in there that I have not told a lot of people. Now, my partners who I live with, they know them. So
Sure.
that is
Yeah.
good. Lots of this stuff is going to be new information I'm a very weirdly, I don't mind talking about things. I'm happy to talk to anyone. I love talking to you. I'll talk to people personally, but I'm not someone who feels the need to share my life on social media. And
Hmm.
before this, I didn't feel the need to write about it. I think I grew up with a certain amount of closed offedness that is just how I experienced the world because partly because I was gay and that was scary, but also I'm somewhat of a loner, and that's just my orientation to life. I have a lot of things I want to do. A lot of them I like to do by myself. I don't mind talking about this stuff, but I tend not to. And particularly the younger stuff, particularly when I'm like, before the age of like 22, 23, where I'm still kind of all over the place, figuring out what my gender is, what my sexuality is. After I kind of like settled into like a lane, I felt a weird sort of embarrassment. It felt so
Hmm.
embarrassing to not know yourself, to not be sure. It wasn't a matter of being embarrassed of who I was, but just the fact that I didn't know felt shameful
Hmm.
almost. Like, how could I not know myself? How could I be confused about something everyone else seemed to have such an ease with, even when it was an unhappy ease, but they knew what they were. And so much of my experience when I was younger was being like, am I trans? Am
Hmm.
I gay? Am I bi? None of these labels seem to work for me, and like so that stuff after a certain point, I just stopped talking about it. And because it was all
Right.
before social media and because it was before the internet, there were not a lot of pictures and it was
Mm,
easy.
right.
And because I had those big walls up, I moved through groups of friends easily. And I was not in touch with most of my high school friends once I was in college. And once I left college, I was not in touch with most of my college friends. And like that is a hard thing. That's something I
Hmm.
worry about a lot in my life. The rootlessness that is both who I am and how I grew up made me very worried that I was going to end up really alone as an older person.
But you haven't. I mean, that's something else that I find really, you called yourself a loner, and yet you talk in this book very openly about like you're in a throuple, you live with other people, like you wanted the community. I can't imagine finding two people you want to be in a relationship with. I don't want to be in a relationship with one. Like, I don't like anyone that much. So that's what I mean. Like, there's a little bit of a contradiction that I find really interesting in that, like, that what you've internalized from when you were really younger, but like you've fought through it in certain ways, obviously.
Yeah, and some of that is very conscious. There came a certain point in my life where I
Yeah.
was like, I am not going to have kids. I'm not going to have the kind of like family that takes care of you when you're older. I have to build other structures. I got to do the
Mm,
work. I live in this incredible, queer communal home where there are six of us who bought a building together, and I knew that that was going to have to be my life if I did not want to be 72 and living in a fifth floor walk up in Brooklyn by myself.
right.
That was not what I wanted in life. And so some of this is conscious. Some of it is that I think that I felt much more like a loner when there were very few people around me who were
Right.
interested in life that I wanted. And also, I'll say this, you know, being a throuple, it's intense. We've been together for 16 years. They were together for 10 years before we got together.
Wow.
We lived together. We've lived together almost the entire time. It takes up a lot of our time and a lot of our life. But there's also a way in which it creates space for me to be alone and for
Yeah.
them to be alone. There are nights where the two of them go do things, or I
Mhm.
go off and they can have space, or we can disagree and we can it oddly creates these like pockets of space inside of our relationship that I really need. Like
Mhm.
I'm sitting in my tiny little office, which is like my separate space with a closed door, and like I need that to write. I just do. And I need friends who are really important to me. My family, my parents growing up, their closest friends were all of our family members, right? Like they
Mhm.
lived in a world where family was everything. And I didn't want that and didn't think it was going to be an option for me. So I built this whole other life, and there is still these pockets of
Yeah.
time and space, and that's really important to me. And luckily both my partners are artists, and so they also need this space to like do their work and make the things they want to make in this world.
Hmm. I want to go back to the beginning of the book for a second because whatever your original chapter was that you cut doesn't matter. You open with a chapter uh, about I'm going to butcher the summary. I always feel like it's so much more eloquent when the actual writer just writes it. But you the thing that stuck out to me the most about the chapter was there's a teacher. She's teaching all of the different ways of saying the F word in different languages. Now, we say fuck here. It's the internet, so obviously that's not the word I'm talking about. And the chapter's not, it's not, you give her a lot of grace. Let me just put it that way. Like you don't even name the teacher. It's just like this was my experience, but it's also, very telling of the time that it happened. And we would never do that today. It also felt like a very like clear entry point into your world of like if this was my experience, it felt like you could already imagine the rest of the things that were to come. Is that, am I reading into this, or is that kind of why this chapter, which is just like really one small piece of your life, but became so important to be the first chapter? Because I will say that like
Yes.
that's the thing that I think about the most in this book, which is crazy because you've had so many other stories that are arguably much more important.
I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. I think that this moment, both for the book, but also for my life, just opened so many things because it was a terrible moment. I loved that teacher, and I don't think she meant to hurt me. I think she didn't think
Right,
that there was anyone gay in specific. She thought she was doing a fun lesson on slang, you know?
right.
I think if she had known I was gay, I actually don't think she would have taught that lesson. But homophobia was funny and fun and slight, and it was 1990, you know? But even in that moment, which was terrible and crushing and made me suicidal and like really did make me feel like, oh my God, there's just no safety in this world for
Yeah.
me. If teachers can do this in class, like what? But even in that moment, by the end of the class, I remember having this thought where I was like, wait a second. If there are words for faggot in every country around the world,
Hmm.
this implies
Right. Yeah.
an existence that I have not found anywhere else. And that, though it took me then months to get past the like, I am so sad, everyone hates me, that little thought stayed in the back of my head. And there came a day where I was like, well, if that's true, if there are other people out there, then I can find them. And if I can find them, then I can get there. And that set me on this road to researching and trying to find history and the present for myself that is so much of what my life has become that I look back and it seems like such an obvious starting place, like I didn't know that at the time, but it drove me to the library where I learned
Mhm.
to use the Dewey Decimal System and the card catalog in order to look up homosexuality and found the first books I ever read that had gay people in them. And those very first books were art history textbooks from like the 50s and 60s talking about Greco-Roman
Right.
statues of like Zeus. Like it was like crazy things. But in that moment, when I found that first book, I can remember thinking, like, wait, there were gay gods. Like, what? This is transformative. And that all came from her deciding to teach this lesson on the F slur because someone
True.
was making a gay joke at me. And and I don't blame her for what happened, though I do think, like it was not a great move as a teacher, not one I can really endorse, but I don't think she was trying to hurt me. I
No,
was
I don't.
hurt.
I would say I don't. I would imagine she wasn't trying to hurt anybody. But what I when I read it the first time, I read the chapter a couple times because the first time I read it, I couldn't get past the like, this is an authority figure teaching you something terrible, like teaching you
Yeah.
about this slur and being like, if this slur exists, then I thought of it like, how did you not internalize this as the slur exists, so I am therefore worthy of a slur, so I am therefore bad. And then I was so mad, like mystified by your brain went the other way and it went, oh wait, there are other people like me. That's good. Like that says more about you than it really says about her, which is also why I think like, oh, it really sets up the book nicely because then it lets you into who you are and who your what your world is. And also again, the obvious, well, this was the 90s and this was the kind of shit
Yeah.
I had to deal with,
Yeah.
the
And it's
limitation.
so funny. I didn't know this then, but this is a practice that I learned in doing all this like queer history. It's called reading against the archive, right? The
Mhm.
source tells you one thing. It's giving you a piece of information consciously. But if
Yes.
you look at it for like sideways, you're like, there is a whole other world of information inside that. And that's the information I actually need. And this was my first moment of having that experience. And that maybe is the other part that is foundational to this, learning that like I could look at what I was being told and ask what other information I could glean
Right.
from it. Could I flip this around and see something from a totally different way? And that is liberatory, right? Like when you learn, I don't have to listen to the message I'm being told. I can listen to the words and I can get something else out of it for me. And all of these things happen for me randomly on like a fall afternoon, a
Right.
sixth period right after lunch in 1990 Spanish class, you know? And so that for the journey, and that's what my brother pointed out to me too. He was like,
Mhm.
your first chapter is not bad, but it's not your starting place.
Right.
And this is the start. And I was like, once he said it, I was like, oh, now I see it. Yeah, absolutely. Oh my God, how could I not have noticed that before? But it really was this like incredibly important moment. And of all the kind of moments in the book, I've always known that that one was foundational. I think about it all the time, have my whole life. And I was like, someday I'm going to return to this moment and understand why it meant so much.
Hmm.
And writing this book, you asked about this before, made me put all of these pieces together. I would sit down, I put all these outlines together. I spent a year outlining and putting all these pieces in that might go into different essays. And then I would sit down to write the scenes. And as I wrote them, I'd try to be like in my body, having that experience, remember what it felt like. And that would trigger all these things where I'd be like, right, right, right. This is how I thought back then. This mattered because back then I did not know anyone gay. And so
Right.
just the indication that there was a whole world meant so much to me because it was 1990. My understanding of gay people basically went like this. They were a modern invention, but they were also a biblical
Right.
abomination, and they had all died of AIDS. So it really
Oh,
didn't matter.
okay.
And that transformed things. To know that there was this much language out there meant so much. It meant there were people. It meant there was a world. There were several worlds, and that was freeing.
And I mean, I have to ask because like it's not just the 90s. You do say 90s and beyond in your title. You do talk a little bit about post 9/11 and certainly like a little bit of your adult life. Do you see the beyond as being also like a follow-up? Do you see that there's more stories that you, after writing this book, you want to tell more of your stories, not just historical stories period?
There are definitely some parts where I think I left myself the room to run in that sense, particularly my relationship now and the house that
Mm.
we've built and the home. That felt like I wanted to, it felt necessary to include it because I think that it shows like the distance I travel from the beginning, both how changed I am, but also how similar. Like my house now is a lot like the house I grew up in, just a different kind of family, you know? So that felt important. But it also felt like there was this long period in between that is based on what happened in my life earlier, but is a separate story, like how we came together and how we built adult lives. That's not exactly this long tail of the 90s story.
Right.
I wanted to show the long tail of the 90s has an ending point, but I sort of pulled all that material out because I was like, it's a separate thing. If I ever want to write about it, it gets to be its own thing. I'm writing about like what I knew and learned in the 90s and how that made me the adult I am now. And so there's like a 14-year period that we just jump in the middle
Right.
of the book that I was like, or not middle, from the second to last essay to the last essay. It jumps 14 years. And I was like, that stuff matters, but it's not for this book. And maybe if I like this experience and I feel that I'm up for writing another personal book, that might be where I go next.
Okay.
But I didn't think it would fit in this. I started to at first do it, and then I was like, no, that's not this story. And that I think is something I talk a lot about. I teach creative writing now,
Yeah.
is figuring out what is the story. Because I think we come to stories for the change, right? If something stays the same, it's boring. After a few pages, we don't want it anymore. If it's a movie and it never changes, you're like, why did I go through this? And so I had to figure out what my arc was. Like,
Mhm.
how did I develop and what were the essential moments? And then clear cut everything around it. When I started, there was so much more that I thought I might be writing about, and it just wasn't appropriate. It didn't tell the right story. It didn't lead the right way. It happened. Sometimes it mattered, sometimes it didn't, but it didn't matter to this book.
Right.
And for this book, for my first book that was not a history where I had like a very set, like I'm telling this date to this date in this place, I was like, I got to figure out a tight arc so that people aren't lost in these years and travel and people and selves. And I knew that I needed to really draw this out and have a sense of the change I was going to track. And so that's kind of like why we jumped so much at the end. And I did leave this other stuff that I might talk about,
Yeah.
but I wanted to really have people walk away and feel like they had seen me go on a journey because that's what it felt like.
Yeah. All right. Well, I hope that you have a good experience with this so that the next one comes. I know it's still early for you to maybe know for sure. But thank you so much for coming on today. And before I let you go, I always like to tell people where to get the things that we talked about. So, unfortunately, To Wong Foo, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar is not streaming. But if anybody has a few bucks, you can buy it or rent it on Apple TV and Prime Video. And then I always leave it to the authors to say, where do you want people to get your books? Is there a particular place where it's the best for you? Sometimes it's like a local store that also has a, digital footprint for people who aren't local. Sometimes it's where the best royalties go. I don't know, you tell us.
I mean, look, anywhere you get it, I'm happy that you get it, particularly if it's an indie bookstore that you love. But the one thing I would ask of people is when I was a kid and I had access to none of this anywhere, libraries were the place that I found life. And if you have a library that you love, request it there because if you request it, they'll buy copies. And it's not just that you'll get it, but that people who could never buy it, either because they can't afford it or they can't be seen with it, will have the opportunity. And that, more than anything else, I don't care. Pirate it from someone, borrow it from somebody, buy it from an indie bookstore, go to Amazon, whatever is the right thing for you, do that. But if you could ask your library to stock it, that would mean so much to me.
You just said can't be seen with it, which is not something I thought about in 2026. But I do want to just say if that is out there, if that is a concern for anyone, libraries also have the Libby app. So you can get it for your Kindle. If you don't have a Kindle, you can get it for the just the app on your phone or device, whatever you use, so nobody can actually see the cover of what you're reading. My friends read a lot of smut that way, but you can read important things that way too. Thank you again, Hugh, for coming on. Thank you everyone for listening and or watching. This is made possible by Pop Culture, the podcast. And stick around because next week we have another author coming on because this is my season of authors. I'm so excited.